Good evening. I'm George Kovac. I'm the editor of Consequence magazine. And welcome. I'm so happy to see so many here to help us celebrate the 6th issue of Consequence magazine. Each time we come out with a new issue, we host an event like tonight. It's something that we do as part of our mission, but it's also an opportunity to publicly thank all of you who support the magazine. Before we start, I'd like to make a few comments about, or at least thank our staff. Our editorial staff is a great group. They work very hard. And I'd like to mention that there are some of them here. Mitch Manning, Christine Ahn, John Pappas, John Lewis, Shilpi Sunija, Anna Ross, and especially Kat Parnell, a Kat who gives so much time to Consequence magazine and who single-handedly was able to convince our 3 guests to participate in the panel tonight. Thank you, Kat. I also want to mention our 2 interns this year. We have Drew Arnold and Nazila Hafezi, and also to make a thank you to this small army of volunteers commanded by Joan Kovac, who make this event possible. Thank you. Now, the theme of tonight's panel discussion is the personal, the political, American culture and militarism. And there are any number of ways to approach this. I think you'll hear from our panel some of those. I think one way to think about this is to look at the gap between the civilian culture and the military culture. We know that the makeup of our armed forces has changed dramatically since the Vietnam era. And since 9/11, an all-volunteer force that today represents about 0.5% of the population. Now, this disparity raises some important questions for us to consider. What does a professional military mean for the 99.5% who don't have to do the fighting and the dying? Do we care? Do we need to care? How are the men and women who serve their country affected by this disconnect and by the military's own insular culture? And how do their families deal with the many deployments, uncertainties, and sacrifices that go hand in hand with a professional military? I think it's very troubling that we do not hear in the media a discussion of these concerns. And I think when we have writers who address the gap between the civilian and military cultures, we have an opportunity to better understand what is at stake for the world in general, for our country, and for the individuals, those of us who stand on the other side of that divide. It's an honor for me, a pleasure to introduce 3 writers whose work contribute profoundly to the subject, the discourse about war. I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak, and after their remarks, we'll have time to expand the conversation and to take questions from the audience. Our first panelist to my left is Lea Carpenter, whose debut novel, 11 Days, was published by Knopf in June of last year. It has been praised as not only a dramatic, affecting, and wholly original story about war from a woman's point of view, but an incisive look at the experience of special operations. It tells of a Navy SEAL officer who goes missing from a mission the same night as the bin Laden raid. As the main character, Sarah, his anguished mother, waits for news of her boy-become warrior, we learn about the intimacy, pride, and sacrifice of military families. This novel helps us understand what motivates young men and women to become elite soldiers It meditates on honor and loyalty and acknowledges the attendant sorrows of war. The title, 11 Days, is a reference to the conclusion of the Iliad that I think Ms. Carpenter will mention and talk about. She worked in literary publishing for 10 years as a former editor at Zoetrope, as an editor for the Penguin Lives series of literary biographies, and most recently as deputy publisher of the Paris Review. She is working on her second novel. Our next speaker, Tony Schwalm, is a retired lieutenant colonel with the U.S. Army Special Forces. Prior to joining Special Forces, he was a tank company commander in Operation Desert Storm and was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. After the attacks of September 11, he served with the U.S. Special Operations Command. Now, as a civilian working for the Department of the Army, he leads a team of social scientists assigned to the Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force Afghanistan, providing socio-cultural analysis to special operations forces deployed there. In 2009, he won the individual essay competition for the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference, and in November 2012, Free Press published his first book, The Guerrilla Factory, The Making of Special Forces, the Green Berets. A Green Beret himself, he reveals in his book the unique culture of the best of the military's best. His book is a fascinating look into the complex training, the broad range of operations conducted by special forces. It shatters the Hollywood stereotype of super warriors defined by their combat skills. It presents instead the ingenuity, intelligence, and versatility of specialists who work clandestinely in small teams, training and enabling indigenous forces whose language they've mastered. Our third guest, Bob Shacochis, is a novelist, essayist, journalist, and educator. His most recent book, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, is one of 2 finalists for the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. It was published last September by Atlantic Monthly Press. The Woman Who Lost Her Soul is that gut-check novel that appears maybe once in a generation, that wakes us from sleepwalking through a turbulent time. His work has received a National Book Award for the first fiction, the Rome Prize in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. He is the author of 2 short story collections, Easy in the Islands and The Next New World, a novel, Swimming in the Volcano, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, and a collection of essays about food and love, domesticity. His book, The Immaculate Invasion, recounts the 1994 military intervention in Haiti, which he covered as a journalist for Harper's Magazine. It was a finalist for the New Yorker Magazine Literary Award for Best Nonfiction Book of the Year, and named a notable book of 1999 by the New York Times. A former contributing editor for Harper's Magazine and Outside Magazine, Mr. Shacochis' op-ed commentaries on the U.S. military, Haiti, and Florida politics have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. His travel memoir of the journeys in the Himalayas between heaven and hell was published in 2012. He currently teaches in the graduate writing programs at Bennington College and Florida State University. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for this evening.
My father was in the Army, my father-in-law was a Marine, and I wrote a book set in the Navy, in the Naval Special Warfare community. I asked 3 guys that I know well in the Navy to read a first draft of my book, mainly, I thought, for errors. I'd also asked a writer I admire, a civilian, critically acclaimed, well-published novelist. And that civilian read my pages and called me back and said, first, cut out all the poetry. These guys don't read poetry. And I almost did, only when the naval officers called me back, they never mentioned the poetry. Near the end of the novel, I describe a raid that takes place in Pakistan. And obviously, I'd never been on a raid I'd shot guns, even automatic ones, but I felt it was far outside my skill set to write about what happens in those houses. I didn't feel it was my place either. It felt not only absurd but weirdly politicized to try and put myself inside that house. So I did something lazy. I sent my main character into a side room in the house, tasked with watching the women and children well away from the quote-unquote kinetic activity. My civilian reader didn't mention that chapter, but all three of those Navy readers did. The youngest, who had recently left the Navy after 8 tours, and who is like a brother to me, which is to say, not afraid to tell me the truth, said, "Lea, if you can't write yourself inside that room, you've failed. You can have the poetry, but you can't have the poetry without the house." And he was right. Perhaps literature must meet up with experience in certain cases. If I tried to do anything, I tried to write a story with a simple tone, almost like a fable, but one that would resonate with a certain audience. On the first page of my book, my heroine ties red laces into her shoes, and that was my nod to Dorothy and Oz. I wanted to take the civilian reader to a foreign place and say a bit about the history and mythology of that place along the way. I also wanted to be true to the experience of people who had been to that place. Something about that civilian reader's response to that house made me realize the absence of knowledge can equal apathy. It sounds very Don Rumsfeld, but I never would have possessed the courage to write about something as broad and grand and male as war until my father died. I had no experience of war, but he did. And as I learned a little bit more about what that meant, it felt less foreign to me. I grew up in peacetime. Terrorism happened elsewhere. If you hit a golf ball from my front door, it would land in a cornfield in one direction and a pasture with horses in the other. When asked why he'd ended up in a place like that, my father would tell people he liked the fact that he could do something in his days, but still encounter a deer on the way home. We had a pool, and before he dove in, he'd remind us, my 5 siblings and me, how many laps it takes to cross the Bosphorus, and weren't we lazy that we only swam in pools. I remember running with him in the woods and how he made the runs seem short by telling stories. If we ran on the road, because sometimes I was afraid of the woods, he would wear an orange vest that glowed when it caught car lights, just in case. And when we hit our pre-designated midpoint, he would signal the upcoming return home with a loud, "Ready about, heartily." It's a sailing term. He drove my siblings and me to school on mornings when he was home, and we rotated days for deciding what to do on the ride. When we could choose, we of course chose the radio, but when it was his turn to choose, he chose stories, usually Greek myths. We knew about the Minotaur before we knew about Spider-Man, and the Minotaur was a favorite myth of mine because I liked that it was a love story in the end. He tried to interest me in the Iliad, but I had no interest. Some of his close friends loved shooting, but he preferred to read, and so eventually they stopped asking him to go along. In Prague once, he took me to see Kafka's house, and as we were waiting in line, a tourist behind us snapped, "Go, go, go." It upset him, and it was the first time I'd seen him shaken. When I asked him about it later, he said simply, "Go, go, go," is what they said before we jumped from the plane. I didn't think about my father as a warrior or an operator or a commando, though after he died, those were words used to describe him by people who knew what those words meant. They sent things to me on subjects very alien at the time. Someone sent a memoir by a pilot who had flown in the Sante raid, inscribed to my father. A member of the OSS, tasked with training Japanese operatives, sent an old manuscript. Another friend or colleague, maybe, actually, I don't know, sent a story about a covert mission in Indochina. I'd never thought to map my father's life by the experiences he'd had before I was born, because I was born when he was in his mid-50s. Yet, of course, he'd had experiences, some in the field of military intelligence. I wanted to learn about something I couldn't believe I'd never studied, the American military. I reached out to guys I knew who had served or were serving in these wars. I asked them for their stories. And then, on a dare from a friend, I started writing. That friend gave me a deadline, May 3rd, 2011. I was writing in London late at night when reports on the royal wedding were interrupted. Osama bin Laden was dead. The American people did not choose this fight, the president said. I tried to write about what it felt like to love someone involved in something so separate from one's own experiences, and I tried to write about the humanity of the men I knew in my own generation, a humanity often defined by humility, precision, and respect as applied to a complex task. I wanted to map the emotions and characters on the edges of a war, not the controversies within war's political context. I felt the characters had been stereotyped, and perhaps I could show things differently. I wanted to look at whether wanting to serve one's country might be like talent or an eye color, something passed from a parent to a child, even if unconsciously. My father loved Remington and Hemingway, Edith Hamilton, and Margaret Yourcenar. Of Shakespeare, he particularly admired Henry V. Only now can I place or connect the lines of things he loved as related to war in a way, stories of heroes or stories that undercut our ideas of heroes. The title of my book, 11 Days, refers to the end of the Iliad. Having finally found time to read it, I see what my father would have loved. Its viciousness, its sly elegance, Athena deflecting an arrow off of Menelaus, or the presence of a shepherd in the slaughter. He would have seen the poetry as literature and history, but also as lesson. He would have admired its artful illustration of what's seductive about war to the warrior. At the end of the story, Priam visits Achilles. Achilles had killed Priam's son Hector to avenge the death of his best friend Patroclus. The men talk and bond. Achilles agrees to stand down his army for a period of 11 days. The Iliad's last pages are a description of those days. It's a remarkable meditation on war, in part because it upsets stereotypes about warriors. War stories aren't really anything more than stories about people anyway. Michael Herr wrote that in Dispatches, and I believe that's true. Thank you.
I believe the gulfs between different types of people, rich, poor, educated, barely literate, military, civilian, are widening. If I'm right, such a trend takes our republic to a circumstance best defined as balkanization. If such a term seems extreme for the 21st century United States, I submit we have already been there. We survived as a nation our Civil War. Such survival does not mean we are immune to another one or similarly horrific events. I believe the violence of war originates in the collision of opposing narratives. Those narratives begin with ideas. Those ideas often originate and propagate at the hands of writers. If such is the case, writers are some of the most dangerous people on the planet. As a soldier, I understand well the concept of a class of people lethal by design. Like soldiers in the U.S. today, writers self-select to their craft. Regardless of genre, they can move nations to war, promote genocide, or inspire a nuanced hatred of things in general. They don't pull the triggers or drop the hellfires, but they make it possible. Maybe the politicians are the bridges between what the writers and the soldiers wrought. Some writers do attempt to bridge the gulf in the minds of their target audiences, but as fewer people serve in uniform, what is written about the U.S. Armed Forces becomes more real in the minds of the uninitiated. What I see lost in the current flood of literature regarding the most current conflicts is the reality of being a person in uniform told to help create something other than devastation. I had long debates with civilians in Afghanistan regarding why an Army or Marine general was not telling the Afghan government what to do. I have explained ad nauseum why our tanks knock over apricot trees in Kandahar province instead of driving around them. People who command armies or drive tanks destroy by design. People who command armies or drive tanks destroy by design. When soldiers go on patrol, they are looking for someone to kill, not someone not to kill. Like hammers in search of nails, soldiers search for targets. Caution. Changing that design is not an option. We must have people who act like killers, who when asked what they do, will respond, kill, kill, kill without mercy. I pray for the day when that class of people may no longer be needed, when people just live to create in peace. Until then, I hope those to close the gulfs I see opening, if by only the smallest amount measurable. I want people to know that when they tell someone in uniform, thank you for your service, they may be thanking him or her for killing several people over the course of a year while everyone else in the United States went shopping. Or for watching a friend die while the folks back home played games built to play the war so far away. I want citizens of our republic to know that under the uniform is someone who volunteered to step into a profession defined by pain, sacrifice, and death. I want the uninformed ones to know that the uniformed ones are destroyers by design, demonstrating compassion by exception. Don't thank us unless you know what you're saying.
I am and always have been a civilian, and yet war, or at least the military, has never not been a part of my life. And so, strangely enough, some of the emblems of war, some of its iconography, and on occasion even its actual machinery and artifacts, are responsible for a type of nostalgia in my consciousness. Which is to say, as an American, I find it impossible, congenitally, intellectually, morally, to separate myself from our nation's warrior culture, our centuries-old tradition of militarism. And I would suggest to you that this intimate connection may actually be a good thing, since it will not allow for complacency or apathy or opinionated ignorance, here in what Jimmy Carter has recently described as the #1 warmongering nation on the face of the earth. For my own family, there has been no tradition of military service to follow until very recently. My grandfather, a peasant, fled Russian-occupied Lithuania before the end of the 19th century to escape a Tsarist conscription drive. My father, born in 1918, was destined to come of age at a time when he had no choice but to wear a uniform. Swept up into the Navy during World War II, but swept away from the coal mining hills of Pennsylvania only as far as New York City, where, as an able-bodied seaman, he was assigned to the Navy's quartermaster unit, outfitting the sailors who were shipping out to Europe and North Africa. 18 months after my birth, my father, by now discharged from the service for several years, uprooted his rapidly growing family and relocated us to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., where he entered into a 30-year career as a quintessential bureaucrat, a civilian manager employed by the military, and a classic Cold War warrior, eventually retiring as the director of the Bureau of Navy Personnel. The first time I ever had any inkling of my father's wartime service was at the beach in Ocean City, Maryland, where our family would vacation. We would always spread a pair of dark, rough, olive green woolen blankets on the sand, and sometime during the late 50s, when I would have been 8 or 9 and already an avid reader of war stories, I asked where the blankets had come from. They were stenciled with the words U.S. Army. "From France," my father answered. "France, how curious." His clarification electrified me. The blankets were from the beaches of Normandy, gathered up with tens of thousands of other items left scattered along the shore after the D-Day invasion, and shipped back to New York City to be sorted and cleaned and redistributed to the troops. One of the blankets had 3 bullet-sized holes in it, and my imagination ran wild. My father also ended up with a Nazi helmet, insignia, bayonet, and other wartime souvenirs from this trove that became, in a way, my toys. I wasn't a military brat per se, but my father's elevated status at BUPERS, the Bureau of Personnel, meant the military was a normal factor in the texture and atmosphere in our family life. Summer weekends, we would drive up the road from McLean, Virginia to Annapolis, where we had fishing and crabbing privileges out on the Naval Academy's wharfs along the Chesapeake Bay. Legendary World War II admirals would frequently stroll out to where we were set up at the end of the pier to chat with my dad and pat us kids on the head. I remember plenty of family outings to the annual Army-Navy games. We could shop at the PX and dine at the officers' clubs in the Washington, D.C. area. When my older brothers joined the National Rifle Association, I enrolled too, and the 3 of us school kids would spend Wednesday nights on the Army base at Fort Myers, shooting our .22 rifles at targets in the basement of the gymnasium. I think I was still in elementary school when one early summer day, before air conditioning, my father took me to work with him, and the open windows of his office in the Navy Annex looked directly down and out upon Arlington Cemetery. It was there, standing in front of those windows, that I heard and saw taps being played for the very first time as a horse-drawn caisson rolled up to a freshly excavated gravesite. That was the first of 3 times my eyes and ears would bear witness to the sacred graveside ritual of taps. I never saw the Beatles. Instead, I saw Kennedy buried. I saw the riderless white horse trot uncertainly down Pennsylvania Avenue, following the caisson bearing the president's flag-draped coffin. I stood very near the gravesite as the bugler stepped forward and the casket was lowered down, and I saw 2 sailors in their loose white uniforms and Dixie Cup hats lean into one another for mutual support, and yet fail in their grief to keep their knees from buckling, and sink and fall together to the ground, weeping in Arlington Cemetery, the nation's necropolis, a place I have known intimately and far too well ever since I was a child. The 3rd time I heard the lugubrious notes of taps played in Arlington Cemetery, it was for my father. As I said, my father was a zealous Catholic Cold War warrior, a type you will hear much about in my novel, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul. And I was one of those children whom America trained to crouch in school hallways and tuck up into a little ball to protect myself in the event of a nuclear attack. In 1969, the year I was issued my draft card and enrolled in college, my father was sent to Vietnam to reorganize the South Vietnamese Navy. And when I came home that next summer from the university, with my hair down to my shoulders, wearing a t-shirt silk-screened with an angry red fist and the slogan, "Strike," with the blood from students at Kent State running in the streets and the smoke of tear gas and burned-out ROTC buildings fresh in my nostrils, we began to fight our own war, father and son, that I suppose sadly never really ended. His words that summer echo in my ears and in my novel. I wish I was dead, he told me, rather than to have spawned a son like you. After an adolescence of assassinations and riots and televised combat, perhaps here's the coda, the final drama of my youth, to the answer of why my aesthetic universe rotates around the literature of political experience. Here's a scene from July of 1968. There's a party. It's a farewell party for one of the guys I work with mowing lawns, Charlie. Charlie's been drafted. He's being shipped to Vietnam. We were all drunk, and Charlie, usually a quiet, sharp-eyed 20-year-old, was very drunk, stumbling around, laughing like a hyena. Toward the end of the evening, when it was time for us all to disperse, Charlie was sobbing out of control and he couldn't walk. His best friend, I forget his name, but he was a huge and brawny fellow who worked as a mechanic at the Esso gas station, propped Charlie up against the side of his '57 Chevy, cocked back his right arm, and punched Charlie's lights out. I had seen dead people before, but I had never seen this. Someone knocked unconscious and dropped like a log. Charlie hit the ground with a sickening thud, his head bouncing. And as I watched his friend pick him up and sling Charlie's dead weight over his shoulder and carry him away towards a very short future, nothing was ever more clear to me than this. Charlie was lost to us. Charlie wasn't ever going to make it back home again. And 6 months later, when I was told that a mortar round had landed in Charlie's lap as he sat in his sandbag bunker in Southeast Asia, I wasn't shocked or even surprised because I felt I had already seen him die. I had been holding the image of his death in my mind all those months. You each have entertained ample evidence over the past dozen years to understand how the media can get things wrong, or if not wrong, then right only to a point that falls short of the truth. During the late 60s and throughout the 70s, I never once witnessed anyone disrespect a soldier or an airman or a sailor who had just returned from Vietnam. Yes, I know it happened, but its instances were rare and overblown, isolated events that were cynically allowed to loop through our nation's psyche. At university in Missouri, I lived in the upper story of a farmhouse, its lower story occupied by 3 recently returned Nam vets going to school on the GI Bill. We talked often, smoking dope together, and they told me about their wounds and horrors, and they told me about the awful things they had done. And like most vets I knew freshly back from Vietnam, they joined us hippies in the anti-war demonstrations, and their enemies were our enemies. The White House, the Defense Department, the war industries, the Congress, various officers in the field. That the stigma has hung so long over our people who fought in Vietnam is a national disgrace, and all of us are responsible for it. We sent them to an unnecessary war they could not possibly win, and then we shamed them for not winning it. When I earned my degree in journalism in 1973, I hitchhiked home, east across half of America, holding a sign that simply said, Watergate. The drivers who picked me up knew where I was going, but I didn't stay long, having taken to heart the redneck admonition, love it or leave it. And so, unrequited, I left America for the next 5 years, seeking a cure for my disaffection. I've told you all this tonight to underscore the fact that each person has a history. Every individual has a context. And if you care to understand that person and her motivations, you must understand his or her history and the context in which that history operates. And so it is with nations and their populations, their collective history and collective culture. And America's history has been both honorable and dishonorable. And our context throughout the past decade or so has been too often shameful and unworthy of us, top to bottom. The female protagonist in my book, who is an intelligence operative like her father was, declares at one point in the story, people who won't choose sides, they don't accept they're responsible for everything bad that happens. That's a quote. I don't know if she's right or wrong about that, but later during a conversation with a Delta Force soldier about the role of civilians in a wartime society, she thinks, who's playing games? We die, they go to the movies. And I do know in this instance she's right, although it's oversimplified. It's much more complicated than that. This disconnect is a choice you can identify and examine on many different levels. And sometimes the choice is made for you, as it was during the Iraq War. You know all too well that the president urged us to go shopping and prevented us from viewing the powerful imagery of the dead returning to Dover Air Force Base. I've been very lucky in the past few months to become friends with Lieutenant Colonel Jesse Goolsby, who, until he entered our PhD program, is still on active duty in creative writing at Florida State, was stationed at the Pentagon and served as the speechwriter for SecDef, that's military speak for Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I have permission to share with you a few of Colonel Goolsby's insights and frustration. So this is Goolsby now. When the invasion of Iraq was imminent, the military was astonished that there weren't people in the streets. Where was everybody? The Pentagon asked itself, and are we really going to roll with this? The administration was happy that the American public didn't care, wasn't watching, and eventually the leadership at the DoD, Department of Defense, had to assume that the citizens simply didn't care about this war. Whenever he wrote a speech for Panetta or the Joint Chiefs, Goolsby would always have the speaker start off with a tenor that emphasized, "We are at war right now." The colonel felt strongly that the first paragraph should always be clear about the fact that we are a nation at war. This is happening right now. Personally, he would have been happy if the nation had to hear that every single day. He believed that when we lose that tenor, we lose too much. Do I have to tell you that invariably and consistently, the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff would delete that first paragraph from their speeches? As for being an American writer, I want to finally accept whatever indictment comes with that identity, which is not the identity of race or sex or religion, but of place and its ensuing complicities. As one of the protagonists in my novel quips, how can it be a conspiracy if everybody's in on it? And yes, we're in on it. We're at the very core of it. There are not many people in this room whom the world doesn't reduce to one basic fact: your Americanness, when they encounter you on their own turf. And there are myriad landscapes out there over the horizon where if I put you on the ground in the morning, you'd be dead or kidnapped by sundown, because whatever you are doesn't matter except that you're an American. You know this, and yet sometimes you don't, or can't quite believe you yourself can be reduced the same way a drone operator reduces people to the green glow of targets. But as I said, if I'm to be indicted, indict me as an American, and not for something so unimportant as being white or being male or whatever. I'm not rubbing myself in the ashes of blame or adorning myself with the self-aggrandizing medals of exceptionalism. I am not acquiescing to anyone's hatred for me as an American, but I accept it without rancor, but also without self-blinding. This is neither resignation nor feigned patriotism, nor any passive acceptance of guilt or a proclamation of innocence, as it is a pronouncement of accountability, that thing for which it seems no one in the system is willing to stand for and be counted. It's a moving into accountability, as Adrienne Rich writes in her own attempt to understand who she is and what that means and what it calls for. It's a moving into accountability, enlarging the range of accountability. The protagonist in the woman who lost her soul like to quote a Tibetan Rinpoche. There's the quote, "Americans try so violently to be nonviolent." Or they quote Richard Strozzi Heckler, a martial arts master and psychologist who trains Green Berets. Here's the quote, "America has been and is a warring nation with a war for every generation," unquote. We want peace, yes, and we're willing to kill for it. I can accept that ethos for what it is. What I can't accept is this massive collective turning away, a turning from truth to fear and hatred, a bloody dynamic with a terrible consequence, best expressed by the statesman Henry Adams in his assessment of General Robert E. Lee. And here's the quote from Adams. You probably have heard it before. "Sometimes it's the good men among us who do the most harm in the world. And in the 21st century, you've lived to see the converse of that. Sometimes it's the worst men among us who cause the most suffering. You know their names. They should be in The Hague." Thanks.
Is there a conversation that might be had among the three of you that talks to what it is that maybe the military culture would need to do itself? Are there any things that the military culture and the military can do to help the American people really understand what their responsibility is? Or is it entirely up to the American, the civilians to understand?
I have the beginning of an answer, and then Tony and Lee will fill in the fuller answer. But my first response is, first, it gets divided between the institution. I mean, I told you what the speechwriter for Panetta, an Air Force colonel, was trying to get them to say, and they won't say it. We're at war. They won't say it. Unless they say it, the military is responsible for that divide as much as apathy among civilians. But you have to make, I think, a distinction between the institution and then individual service members. And individual service members come home and more or less they're vocal about what they've been, what they're challenged by now. They write books, they write articles, they go to talk to other vets, they talk to their communities. They do the best they can, and we know about them, and journalists do report on them. You just have to care enough to pay attention to those reports. So there's a lot going on there. But if the military doesn't help us, if they want to pretend too that there's no fucking war, are you kidding me? There's going to be a divide, and it's a divide that is stigmatized by sickness, by a disease in the culture. You guys jump in.
Oh, I can't add to that.
Then let's just open fire.
I think the problem right now with the narrative that's coming from the military is that it gets distorted by words like special operations, and these are Marines, and there's these things that go on. There are several wars going on right now in Afghanistan. There is one war that the preponderance of what I would call the conventional forces, they're sitting around, their war is on boredom. And they sit on bases, and they get rocketed. And they get rocketed, and then they go home, and they talk about how they got rocketed. And then someone says, oh, that's amazing. Wow. And then there's this other conflict going on with all these special operations teams, Marine Special Ops detachments, Navy SEALs platoons, and Army Special Forces teams. And they're living in these, and I call them these little Alamos waiting to happen. There are these little bases, about 50 of them, all across Afghanistan, and they're working with Afghan national security forces, and they go off and they drink tea, and they all have a great time, and they walk down roads and they get blown up, and you don't hear about it because you got to go outside the wire to get blown up, unless one of those rockets gets lucky. And so they have a totally different experience of what's going on than the guys that are derisively referred to as the FOBITs. You know, so a FOB is an FOB, a forward operating base. And if you live on a FOB, you're a FOBIT. With or without the furry feet, you're a FOB. And if you never leave the wire, you're really a FOBIT. And so I guess every war's got its word for those. And there's a hard time because people have a vision in Lea's book. What I loved about Lea's book is that she very much humanizes these superhumans, these Navy SEALs. You know, and everybody's got this vision of a Navy SEAL. He's built like a barn. He can bench press a house, and he shoots all these amazing weapons. He's nearly bulletproof. Okay, well they're not. And about 3 weeks after I left one of these little Alamos that are in Afghanistan all over the place, a man that was built like a tank, and he could bench press a house, and he had both his legs blown off, and he bled out. And they named a mortar after him. One of the mortars in the little base, they named that after him. That was how the team responded. What the hell is that narrative? How do you tell somebody about that? How do you make someone empathize? You named a mortar after him? And it wasn't even his name, it was his nickname, his nom de guerre. And I think the disconnect now as we go further and further away between military and civilian worlds is that, you have a guy like Colonel Goolsbee who's trying to say, look, hey, we're at war. Well, what does that mean? I talked to my buddy, he got back, he never left the FOB. I talked to another buddy, all he did was run around waiting to get shot. Every once in a while, you have these spectacular raids that nail somebody, and that's what hits the media. That's what hits the press. And that's, it's like, yeah, look, see, we're winning. It's like, well, no, you're not. You're playing cowboys and Muslims. And if you're going to keep playing cowboys and Muslims, they're going to keep making Muslims that want to play against the cowboys. Well, yeah. Well, wait a minute. Are you sure? And when you try to bring it down to this isn't a game. It's not something we can win. It's something we do. And when you have that conversation with certain very, very senior people, they go, yeah. No, yeah, what? What was that? I'm telling you, we're perpetuating this. It's got to be a multi-pronged effort, and the civilians have a huge role. The 99.5% of us that aren't walking around waiting to get blown up have a huge role to play. And you vote. And you write letters, and you tell people, hey, are we doing this right? And I'll dominate the whole night, so shut up. That's not even on the back of the page.
We want you to dominate the night, Tony. As a writer, as someone trying to look at this subject with language, the definitions of everything, let's just start with the word war and what that means, seem to be shifting as I was trying to write about this subject. I have a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, 2 sons, and they like to sleep in my bed. And I've been thinking for the longest time, this is not a good cultural norm in my house. Like, how do I change the culture of these 2 little people? And I've failed. So imagine trying to change a culture of an organization as large and vast and varied and storied as the American military. And by the way, that, you know, as Tony and Bob know so well, I mean, there's so many cultures within the military, but trying to change one of them, let alone the culture of the organization at large, seems to me a task I don't want to be in charge of strategic planning for. I don't know how you do that. So I wouldn't presume to know.
I actually had that question asked in one of the things that I do whenever I can is adjunct faculty for a business school in Tampa. And people have asked the question, how do you change a culture? Because I love to talk about the power of culture. And one of the things you have to do, and my definition of culture is that those are the unwritten rules of success within the organization. Have you ever seen anyone who rides a Harley Davidson? Right? There must be a book out there, you know, how to look cool on a Harley Davidson. Because, I mean, it's black leather and tattoos and prison time desired. But, you know, I mean, there's no book. I mean, you just, you know, so what's successful is black leather and, you know, throwing your helmet, you know, and, you know. So if you want to change the culture, how do you define success within the organization? And when we start to promote thinkers within the Department of Defense, people who say things that need to be said. I mean, the purpose of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, everyone understands the purpose of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his role is special advisor to the president, period, has no command authority. He is there purely as an advisor. That's what he's supposed to do. Did he get selected because he demonstrated phenomenal cooperation? Was he selected because, you know, he was a writer, he was a thinker? I think if we want to change the culture within the military, you begin by defining how people are chosen for their success. Most people in intelligence, I don't know if there's anyone here from the intelligence community, but no one gets promoted in the intelligence community because they cooperated or collaborated. They get promoted because they knocked a home run. They found the nugget. Look, here's the ticking bomb. This is it. Oh, well, you're a boy or girl. You're going to make it. So until we start, and I think that reflects American society writ large. You know, who's the best guy? Who's the one that brought in the homer? Who sank the basket at the buzzer? You know, who scored the? You know, the rest of the team sort of lost in the hero worship of the moment. So I think in order to change a culture, we start by defining what is success in the culture. And I'm, you know, good luck with that, Bob.
Good luck, Bob. One of the greatest American writers on the nature of war was a man who died recently in Philadelphia named Paul Fussell. He was a brilliant writer about war. And he had been an infantryman at the Battle of the Bulge, and of course that transformed him, and he came home and he became a scholar and a writer and brilliant at both. And Paul, who had certainly paid his dues on the uniform side of the line of American culture, said that all war is a crime. And I agree with that. All war is a crime. It's also a crime to not protect the ones you love and are obligated to protect. That's your duty as a protector. We have assigned protectors in our society. A family assigns a protector. Daddy, protect us. Okay, if you can't do it, call the cop and let the cop protect us. It's a crime not to protect the ones you love. So choose your crime. You're between a rock and a hard place there. And something has to happen. Now, all I want, really, I think the military does, I'm sorry, I think it does a pretty good job. It's civilians send soldiers to war. Civilians, when I look at what's broken, I look at the civilian leadership, and that's basically broken. One of the reasons it's broken is because Americans are in denial that they live in a country that was founded on war, a couple types of war, a war of liberation, we like that one. But how about the wars of genocide? that we all benefit from when we want to go buy a piece of land anywhere in America, because it was never our land. We took it and we killed everybody on it. Okay, that's us. Have we ever stopped that behavior? We haven't. And you're seeing it in full bloom in your lifetimes. From the beginning of your lifetime to the end of your lifetime. There it is. Why can't Americans admit that we are one fucking bloodthirsty nation? We are. Now, sometimes you can look at the war and say, oh, that was such a nice war. That was a just war. That was a good war, and we're great. But other times you have to look at it, and most of them in our lifetime, it's like, what the hell was that about? Why did we do that? Why are there millions dead on the enemy side and all these people we loved on our side? Why is that? It was stupid. How come we couldn't stop it? Well, because the people didn't stop it. And finally, the people did stop. To a large extent, it was people in the streets with Vietnam that stopped it. Without those people in the streets, that war was going to go on until the generals got their way. Because the presidents didn't want it either, but by the time they were in it, they were stuck. And it's just a collective insanity, and Americans won't admit it. America won't look in a mirror and say, shit, we are a war-mongering nation. Imagine you're anybody else on earth that's not in America and stand there in their shoes and look back at our country. What do you see? A country to be terrified of, frankly. I'm serious. Now, we can look out and see countries that scare us, boogeyman countries that scare us too. There are wonderful people here from Iran tonight, and their country is the boogeyman of the month. For us, and they got their own problems. They know, God save us all. God's mercy on us all, but imagine standing somewhere else on earth and looking back on America. I wish every American would do that in their heart. We are terrifying the world. We really are. I'm not saying we're terrorists. That's too complicated. But we are terrifying the world. Like, what the hell are they going to do next? They're out of control. And we are. We can't control ourselves. We don't know what we're doing. And I don't think we're as afraid anymore. We were afraid after 9/11. I think Boston was a great proof of that. Fuck you, Boston said. Boston's strong. It was awful to have the marathon bomb, but, I think it's like, so go ahead, do it again, I dare you. Fuck you. I was teaching at UMass today out on the Columbia Point, and there was a bomb scare. Everybody yeah. Yeah, so bring on your badass mom. Anyways, I think that we've stopped being afraid, or at least we should have stopped being afraid quite some time ago. And it's time to make our decisions without the fear that 9/11 caused. I know it traumatized us as a nation, and rightfully so, but it's time to behave like Boston.
Please join me in thanking Lea, Tony, and Bob for joining us.